Recording in progress.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning.
Got it. All right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I just wanted to start today just acknowledging the loss of our Sangha member Scott. And there's a card for Leslie, and just, yeah. All right. So let's see. Great is the matter of birth and death. Today's kind of an auspicious day for me. It's September 10th, I became a dad. My firstborn was born. I think emotional to say that. Yeah, so, yeah, great is the matter of birth and death. And I'll share a little story just so you can see how brave and tough I am and under fire. I was there at the birth of my son, and I fainted. So the last thing I remember is the doctor saying, "Somebody grab Dad." Down we went. All right. So today I'll be talking about non-duality. So I'll try to cover it as best I can. I will start with saying a thank you to our wonderful teacher, Shinshu and Jaku, for this opportunity to express my understanding with you, my Sangha. I also want to acknowledge the technologies and Mark, the wizard behind the curtain, that allowed me to research this talk from home. Before the internet, I would have had to spend untold hours in the religion and philosophy stacks at UCSC. And sometimes I take this incredible gift for granted, that to have access to centuries of Dharma and the world's philosophies and religions at home, right? So, internet. and then the other side, social media and everything that goes along with it. So as I wrote in my email to the group, this talk is more of a philosophical overview in nature. In my last Dharma talk, in this summer of 2020, I talked about three aspects of the middle way. One of the three, non-duality, seemed to pique the most interest, so that's why I chose to talk about it more today. So the understanding of non-duality predates the Buddha, so it's been thought and written about for over 3 millennia. So I'll sum all those 3,000 years up in 20 minutes here. So there's aspects of it in all the world's religion, and the fun part about giving a talk about it, that it is in its essence beyond language. It's a concept that's impossible to express accurately, as every word seems to somehow miss the mark. An Advaita Vedanta teacher that I like a lot, Rupert Spira, said of non-duality, "Nothing that is said in the non-dual teaching is true. If we want to speak about truth, we should remain silent. We can only evoke the ultimate truth." One of my favorite philosophers, Ludwig Wittgenstein, with whom I share a birthday, said, "What one cannot speak of precisely, one must pass over in silence." Yet, as Katagiri Roshi so wisely said, and yet we have to say something. So, I will say something. I'll be approaching the subject in 3 sections. First is a history and a philosophical overview, then through the lens of Buddhism, and lastly, non-dual awareness. After each section, I'll stop and open things up for questions. Hopefully we'll get through all 3 sections at the end. It'd be really nice just to hear what people think about all of it. Just to kind of get what they think of non-dualism. So, non-duality, or non-dualism, is a rejection of dualistic thinking, with dualism being defined as something divided into 2 contrasting aspects. On a deeper level, it becomes a merging, an equanimity between those contrasting aspects. It originated in early Indian asceticism, which is pre-Buddhist and Hindu, It was later documented in the Upanishads, which are the sacred Hindu Sanskrit texts. The term is derived from the Sanskrit word Advaita, which means not two, or one without a second. Although no grouping exists that I know of, I personally see non-duality in three types or understandings that I'll go into further later in the talk. The first is the oppositions of consciousness, which is right and wrong, good and evil, joy and sorrow, etc. Second is the non-duality of subject and object, which is the dissolution of self and other. It's often called, they call it grasper and grasped. Lastly, it is the common identity of the Absolute, what we Buddhists call Dharmakaya, or the non-duality of Buddha and sentient beings. In more Western language, the unity of God and man. Trying to talk about the Dharmakaya, the Absolute, Brahman, or God is challenging, but there are definitions for the concepts that I'll talk about today that I do like. For Dharmakaya, I found on one on Lions Wars website. It is the ultimate body, the Absolute. It is without form, substance, or concept of any sort, including existence and non-existence. It is the formless form we enter through the gateless gate. The Dharmakaya is, as it says in one Vajrayana chant, nothing whatever, but everything arises from it. For the Hindu Brahman, this is the one I found most thorough. It is the highest universal principle, the ultimate reality in the universe. It is the immaterial, efficient, formal, and final cause of all that exists. It is the pervasive, infinite, eternal truth, consciousness, and bliss, which does not change, yet is the cause of all changes. Brahman is the metaphysical concept that refers to a single binding unity behind diversity in all that exists in the universe. That's pretty good. Our unity with this absolute is what I'll be talking about in the last section. One important point here is about language. Though Hindu Vedanta uses the English consciousness for the absolute, the one that we all are, in Buddhism, consciousness is the individual in dualistic vijnana. So that's really important to kind of keep that in mind. That's our fifth skanda, right? Also, physicists and cognitive scientists also use consciousness for this same universal absolute. I realize this is an already confusing, makes an already confusing subject even more confusing, but I'll do my best to keep it sorted. So touching on how non-duality is an aspect of all the world's religions, looking back even further in time than the Indian ascetics to about 1450 before the Common Era, in the book of Genesis of the Hebrew Bible, there is a perfect metaphor for non-duality that we're all familiar with, and that is the Garden of Eden. In one of the creation narratives, this paradise, Eden, God gave Adam only one law, and that was he was free to eat from any tree in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the first duality. Eating the fruit not only gives Adam and Eve additional knowledge, but gives them the ability to conjure negative and destructive concepts such as shame and evil. From then on, using our Buddhist language, they lived veiled by delusion, as they could no longer see that they were still in the garden. Duality had veiled the truth. In Hinduism, Advaita, non-dual Vedanta, is the oldest still existing tradition of the Hindu school Vedanta. The term Advaita, not two, refers to the idea that Brahman, I just defined earlier, alone is the ultimate real, while the transient phenomenal world is an illusory appearance of Brahman. In this view, Atman, the experiencing self, and Atman Brahman, the highest self, and absolute reality is non-different. The individual self is a mere reflection or limitation of the singular Atman in a multitude of apparent individual bodies. So that's the first section. So if anyone has any questions on the screen, or Vicky.
Thanks, Ron. I just wanted to hear again the definition of Atman, and this is a personal thing because my daughter-in-law and her parents took that name. They have a kind of a Hindu tradition as Westerners, but if you could explain it again.
Yeah, Atman is just this. Atman is self. Yeah, and this the Brahman Atman is that unification of this self and what I described earlier as Brahman. So it's just self.
So it could be, I mean, I'm just trying to imagine why one would name oneself Atman. But maybe it's always because of the dualism, it's recognizing the relationship with Brahman.
Absolutely, because that's what we're talking about here. It's non-dual. So our idea of this self as being individual is an idea. The reality is Atman Brahman. So Atman contains Atman Brahman, whereas there is no separation.
Right, thank you.
And to follow, I mean, in Buddhism, we put the language of anatman in, which is no self.
Right.
And so that it's one of those all-encompassing words. It's, yeah. And I had a thought, Ron, about the definition of consciousness in Advaita Vedanta of being, like you said, Atman, Brahman, everything. And it made me just want to tease apart with the 5 skandhas, so form, feeling, perception, formation, consciousness. That's what you're referring to when you say
Right.
the 5th skandha, that consciousness is our own little mental concepts happening and very reifying self versus, okay.
Correct. So this awareness, by the way, can everyone hear at home on the screen? Yay! Oh yeah, you're there too. So, yeah, in the skandhas, so when this self arises as consciousness, so, that includes what we're seeing, what we're hearing, taste, the senses, and then the mind also is creating, our thoughts are creating, and that's this individual consciousness, that 5th skandha.
Thank you.
And then, yeah, we'll go on to the other one. All right.
Ron,
Yes.
I have a question. Early on in your talk, you referred to a comparison with God and somebody. Can you read that piece again?
What did I say?
Brahman. That was Brahman.
Yeah, I think it was, let's see here.
But what were you comparing?
Well, just, in languages, this is a philosophical overview, so the religions of the world each call this universal absolute consciousness different things. And then it's further confused by, I grew up Roman Catholic, and in Roman Catholicism, that is separated from the self. We look to God, right? But in the mystical tradition, Christian mystical tradition, it has this we are. So there's that separation. So that gets teased apart. And even in some aspects of Hinduism, there's that separation that Brahma is removed from. But what I'm talking about today is this mystical, like the Sufis and all the major religions have this aspect that we are one with the divine. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, section 2 is non-duality in Buddhism. So in early Buddhism, the first time Advaita appears, non-duality, appears in one of my favorite sutras, the Vimalakirti Sutra. Hang on a sec. For those that don't know the story of the sutra, it centers around a lay Buddhist meditator who's attained a very high degree of enlightenment, considered by some second only to Buddhas. He's a wealthy merchant, a husband, and a father. However, he is also a powerful bodhisattva with Buddha-like qualities. He enters dens of iniquity such as gambling parlors, brothels, and even the haunts of the philosophers of other schools, the worst. But while he's in these places, he is merely appearing to conform to the ways of those worlds in order to bring sentient beings to the realization of truth. So the sutra is based on him pretending to be sick, and the Buddha asking his disciples and bodhisattvas one by one to go check up on him. In the sutra, they all refused, saying that on prior occasions, when they met with him, he showed them up with his deep understanding of the doctrines. So the early chapters are one disciple after another telling Buddha their "please don't make me go back there" story. Finally, the Buddha dispatches Manjushri, the great wisdom bodhisattva. Then all kinds of miraculous things happen, including Vimalakirti transforms his small room into a vast palace with 32,000 thrones that are all floating on lotus petals. The thrones are so large that the bodhisattvas in Manjushri's entourage have to make their bodies bigger just so they can sit in the thrones. So chapter 8 in the sutra is titled Entering the Gate of Non-dualism. In this chapter, 31 bodhisattvas with all kinds of wonderful names like Bodhisattva direct seeing, Bodhisattva pure understanding, and Bodhisattva unblinking give their understanding. So I'm just going to read a bit of the chapter here. It starts with, at that time, Vimalakirti said to the various bodhisattvas, "Sirs, how does the bodhisattva go about entering the gate of non-dualism? Let each one explain as he understands it." Here are a couple of the understandings. The Bodhisattva flower garland said, "From the concept of self arises the concept of two things, self and other, which creates a dualism. But one who sees into the true form of the self will not give rise to the thought of two things. And if one does not dwell in the thought of two things, then one will be without consciousness and without anything to be conscious of, and in this way may enter the gate of non-dualism." I think this "one will be without consciousness" is that statement alone is pretty interesting. I think it refers to the knower and knowing, right? The self and our sense consciousness. And without anything one is conscious of is referring to the sense object, right? So it's knower, knowing, and what is known, right? So without those, one may enter the gateless gate. The Bodhisattva Tranquil Root said to speak of the Buddha, the law, and the assembly, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, the Buddha is none other than the law. The law is none other than the assembly. These three treasures are all uncreated in form, like the empty sky, and all dharmas are the same. Who can act in accordance with this understanding may thereby enter the gate of non-dualism. When the various bodhisattvas had finished one by one giving their explanations, they asked Manjushri, "How then does the bodhisattva enter the gate of non-dualism?" Manjushri replied, "To my way of thinking, all dharmas are without words, and without explanations, without meaning or substance, without cognition, removed from all questions and answers. In this way, one may enter the gate of non-dualism." Then Manjushri said to Vimalakirti, "Each of us has given an explanation. Now, sir, it is your turn to speak. How does the bodhisattva enter the gate?" At that time, Vimalakirti remained silent and did not speak a word. Manjushri sighed. "Excellent, excellent. Not a word, not a syllable. This truly is to enter the gate." So when this chapter on entering the gate of non-dualism was preached, 5,000 bodhisattvas in the assembly were all able to enter the gate of non-dualism and to learn to accept the truth of birthlessness. So I always like that because only 5,000 of the 32,000 entered the gate, right? So what happened to the other 27,000? So they didn't quite get it. So I find that very encouraging. So this sutra became an important text in Zen because of the notion that the truth is beyond language, and a framed act of silence is sometimes the most complete expression. As I shared in my last talk, in chapter 10 of the Platform Sutra, our sixth Zen ancestor, Huineng Daiken Eno, gives instructions for the teaching of the Dharma. He enumerates 36 basic oppositions of consciousness. That's what I was talking about earlier. And explains how the path is free from both extremes. He breaks them down into 3 groups, 5 pairs concerning external and animate states, heaven and earth, dark and light, yin and yang, fire and water, 12 pairs concerning language and the attributes of dharmas, phenomena, conditioned and unconditioned, material and immaterial, moving and still, high and low. And lastly, there's 20 pairs concerning the functioning or arising of our own natures, true and false, foolish and wise, right and wrong, kind and harmful, joyful and angry. So in teaching his disciples about these opposites, he said, if one, and he's referring to a student that his disciples may be teaching in the future, asks about the worldly, use the paired opposite of the saintly. And if asking about the saintly, use the paired opposite of the worldly. This mutual causation of dualities gives birth to the gives birth to in the meaning of the middle way. So many Zen teachings and koans utilize these oppositions. Whenever a student uses one word to point to something, the teacher uses the opposite in a clever way. This is intended to loosen the grip of our grasping minds. This way of teaching is fundamental to Zen. It is intended to help us see that these oppositions, all of these oppositions, arise mutually. There's a mutual dependence upon each other, and eventually to see beyond the oppositions to the fundamental non-duality, where subject and object are no longer separate, which is the second understanding. So the non-dual teaching I assume we're most familiar with is the Sandokai, the merging of difference and unity by our 8th Zen ancestor, Capitola California, that we chant here in our temple. In it, there's a particularly sharp and important merging of opposition. Right in light, there is darkness, but don't confront it as darkness. Right in darkness, there is light, but don't see it as light. Light and dark are relative to one another, like front and back foot in walking. So in this, darkness is emptiness, the absolute, and light is form, the material, the relative. In emptiness is form, and in form there is emptiness. So a central teaching in Buddhism. And I like this, the Sotoshu, this is the latest translation, front and back foot in walking. I really like that. So if you're imagining that light and darkness are a dark leg and a light leg, they're constantly changing their position from light and darkness. Light is always becoming darkness as it steps forward. Darkness is always becoming light as it steps forward. So it's a beautiful metaphor. So that is the Zen Buddhism section. Are there any questions? Sue?
Could you give an example of, like they say, okay, when someone comes to you and they use the word for one, you use the word for opposite?
Yes.
Like, my neighbor's really bugging me, Ron.
Right. Well, in that example, we'd like to see that we're not separate from our neighbor, that our ourselves and our neighbor are the same, are the one and the same thing. But there's my own experience with this. was when I found myself really grasping onto an idea with my former teacher, Catherine. I'd be really hanging on to something. She would always turn it upside down on me, you know, whatever it was. If I was hating and it was about love, it was, you know, and it was just using that opposite to just try to like, wait a minute, this thing that I'm hanging on to is arising with, this hate is arising with love. This anger is arising with joy. You know, joy depends on anger. Anger depends on joy. They arise together. We wouldn't know what joy was without the anger. They arise together. Mutual causation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the middle way.
The middle way. Ah, there it is, the middle way. Anybody there on the screen? All right. This is the most challenging part, the non-dual awareness. So I'm gonna take a little break.
It's a comment, not a question, to help you in your break.
Okay.
I feel very bathed in the Dharma during this discussion, and I just want to acknowledge your well-studied practice, and just hearing you chose Katagiri's method of you have to say something, and there's nothing to say about any of this, and you're doing a beautiful job saying all this stuff about it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's very challenging because it just can't be spoken of, you know, especially this last section. So I'm pulling from all over the place here. Okay, non-dual awareness. This last piece I want to talk about, non-dual awareness, is also called pure awareness or pure consciousness. Non-dual awareness is the non-differentiation between the self and what I talked about earlier, the Dharmakaya, the absolute. As I mentioned, our poetic and esoteric Zen tradition realizes that when something is ineffable, beyond words, it uses images like the moon reflected on water, or Dogen telling us, take the backward step and turn the light of awareness inward. While those metaphors are perfect and true, for this subject I found the Advaita Vedanta teachings very helpful. While they used many Buddhist concepts, they use ordinary language more freely to open it up. So I'll also refer to a cognitive scientist and even physicists in trying to explain this absolute awareness. The Vedanta texts describe a deep primordial consciousness that lies behind our own awareness. It's an awareness described as everywhere and nowhere. The essence of being and witness consciousness, which is a term which comes from the Sanskrit word sakshi. Sakshi refers to pure awareness that witnesses the world but does not get affected or involved. Sakshi is described as beyond time, space, and the triad of experiencer, experiencing, and experienced, which is what I was talking about earlier, right? The knower, knowing, and what is known. Sakshi witnesses all thoughts, words, and deeds without interfering with them or being affected by them. This reminded me of a term that's used to describe both the Buddha and Christ, in the world, but not of the world. And a little side note, my friend Patty asked me, where did that come from? And it's actually from the Gospel of John, and Jesus is actually referring to himself and his disciples in the world, but not of the world. In a book with a very interesting title, The Non-Dual Awareness Dimensional Assessment. Just makes you want to pick it up and take it. The authors describe non-dual awareness as being central to contemplative wisdom traditions. It is a state of consciousness that rests in the background of all conscious experiencing, a background field of awareness that is unified, immutable, and empty of mental content. Yet it retains a quality of cognizant bliss. This field of awareness is thought to be ever present, yet typically unrecognized, obscured by discursive thought, emotion, and perceptions. A way to imagine this awareness consciousness was put forth by Donald Hoffman. He's a professor of cognitive science at UC Irvine. He proposed this consciousness to be like the software running everything behind our personal computers. The software is consciousness itself, and our consciousness, that fifth skandha, is the desktop interface as we point and click on the images and sounds of our conscious experience. The absolute consciousness described here is the software running everything behind the scenes, completely invisible. So in our contemplative moments, when our mind's quiet and we become aware of our own awareness, as it moves from a sight to a sound to a thought, we become aware that we aren't our thoughts. Thoughts are something that we are aware of. In those moments, we can notice awareness itself, the awareness of the totality. What does that mean? Imagine the consciousness of every atom. This is a concept that was put forth by the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman, who said, in the world, space has produced atoms with consciousness. Another Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Max Planck, who's the developer of quantum theory, he said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as a derivative from consciousness. So consciousness is the ground of the universe. In the Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual realization of this primordial consciousness we're talking about is described as witnessing but not disengaged from the entanglements of the ordinary mind. So this is what Dogen talks about in Samadhi, the traps and snares, those entanglements of the ordinary mind. So the disengagement of that is considered what we call moksha, release from suffering and samsara. So this is from a Vedanta text called the Vaka, I'm really bad with this stuff, Vaka Asudha. When form is the object of observation, then the I is the observer. When the I itself is the object of observation, then the mind is the observer. When the pulsations of the mind, going through all our senses, when the pulsations of the mind are the objects of observation, then Sakshi, witnessing consciousness, is the real observer, and it is always the observer. And being self-luminous can never be the object of observation. When the notion and the attachment that one is the physical body is dissolved and the Supreme Self is realized, then one, wherever one goes, there one experiences Samadhi. And Samadhi is being the concentration and the unification of the mind. So in closing, again, this understanding crosses all the major faiths. Rumi, the Sufi mystic, wrote, "The moon passes over the ocean of non-being. In the desire of the one to know itself, we exist." Using his poetry to describe the experience, he wrote, "For days I am not in the world, nor am I out of it. Not here, not there, only silence, light, and space." From our Zen tradition, Hongjen Daimon Konen, our 7th century 5th ancestor, simply wrote, "Maintaining awareness of the mind is the fundamental basis of nirvana." And lastly, a simple metaphor from the poet and Zen practitioner Leonard Cohen that sums it all up for me. I love. If you don't become the ocean, you will be seasick every day. Thank you very much.
Ron, if I can